Tehran has issued its clearest warning yet. If the United States attacks Iran, Iranian forces will strike American military bases across the region. Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi made the statement explicit in recent interviews, saying Iran cannot reach US soil, but has every capability and intention to hit US bases in the Gulf, Iraq, Syria, and beyond. He called those bases legitimate targets and drew a careful line. Iran will not attack neighboring countries themselves, only the American installations inside them. At the same time, Iran and Russia have just completed the main phase of joint naval drills in the Gulf of Oman and the northern Indian Ocean. The exercises, hosted out of Bandar Abbas, involved Iranian Navy and IRGC units, Russian warships, including a Steregushchi-class corvette, helicopters, and special forces. They practiced intercepting hijacked vessels, coordinated command and control, and rapid response maneuvers, exactly the kind of operations that would matter if the Strait of Hormuz ever became a battlefield. Iranian commanders described it as a routine show of maritime security cooperation, but the timing could not be clearer. It sends a direct message to Washington while US carrier strike groups are surging into the same waters. On the diplomatic track, Araghchi struck a more hopeful note after the second round of indirect talks in Geneva on February 17th. He told Iranian state television the discussions produced good progress and that both sides reached a broad understanding on a set of guiding principles. The two delegations will now begin exchanging draft texts for a possible agreement. Oman's foreign minister, who mediated, called it constructive and said clear next steps were identified. A US official confirmed Iran has promised to return with detailed proposals within 2 weeks, but the gaps remain wide and unchanged. The United States still insists on zero uranium enrichment and wants limits on Iran's ballistic missile program, plus curbs on support for proxies. Iran continues to reject any permanent end to enrichment, calling it a sovereign right for civilian purposes, and refuses to put missiles or regional allies on the negotiating table. Araghchi has been careful not to promise breakthroughs. He simply says the path is now clearer than it was after the first round in Oman. Why is Iran mixing tough military signaling with measured diplomatic language? Because it faces the same pressure that forced it back to the table. The Trump administration's explicit threat of military strikes if no meaningful deal emerges, coupled with the largest US naval and air presence in the region since 2003. Tehran calculates that showing strength through Russian drills, public retaliation warnings, and IRGC exercises in the Strait of Hormuz earlier this week raises the cost of any American attack and buys time for the talks to continue. At the same time, it cannot afford to walk away from diplomacy entirely. The economic pain of sanctions and the memory of last summer's strikes on its nuclear sites are still fresh. On the ground, the US buildup continues. USS Abraham Lincoln already on station, USS Gerald R. Ford en route, additional fighters, destroyers and submarines moving into position. Iran is fortifying key sites, moving missile units, and keeping its proxy networks on alert. Oil markets are jittery. Any hint of Hormuz disruption sends prices higher. Russia's involvement in the drills adds another layer. It signals that Moscow will not stand aside if conflict erupts. Possible consequences break into two clear paths. If the guiding principles turn into a real text and both sides compromise, Iran accepting verifiable limits on enrichment levels and stockpile size in exchange for phased sanctions relief, we could see de-escalation within weeks and a new, narrower nuclear framework. But if the gaps on enrichment and missiles prove unbridgeable and Trump decides the 10 to 15-day window he mentioned has closed without sufficient movement, the risk of limited or broader US strikes rises sharply. Iran has repeatedly said it would respond by hitting US bases and possibly attempting to disrupt shipping in the Strait of Hormuz. That scenario would almost certainly pull in Israeli forces, activate proxy attacks from Lebanon to Yemen, and send oil prices spiking 30 to 50% or more in a matter of days. One additional point worth noting, this is classic Iranian resistance diplomacy. Talk while preparing to fight, and fight only enough to force a return to talks. The presence of Russian naval forces in the drills is not just symbolic. It complicates any US planning by adding another great power variable in a confined waterway. Watch the next 2 weeks closely. If Iran delivers concrete proposals on the nuclear file by early March, diplomacy still has a chance. If the language stays vague and the military posturing intensifies, the region is moving toward confrontation. That is where things stand tonight. Tough words from Tehran, joint drills with Moscow, cautious optimism from the negotiating table, and 2 carrier strike groups closing in. The next moves will decide whether this ends in a deal or in fire.